So welcome to our week on Periklean Athens. This week is going to have three main themes. First, the life and times of Perikles of Athens himself. Who he was, where his antecedents brought him, and where the consequences of his political actions brought his city. Next, we're going to look at Perikles' central cultural project, the Acropolis building program, the Parthenon, the Propylaea, and the Erechtheum. Finally, we're going to take a look at the Periklean festival. The festival really encapsulates how Athens saw itself in terms of the wider community and Greek religion. Perikles first came to prominence in Athens as actually one of the elected prosecutors of Chion in 463-462 when he was ostracized for colluding with the Spartans. According to the Roman historian and biographer Plutarch, Perikles became a popular leader and one of the most influential men in Athens after this ostracism of Cimon. Now, little is known of Perikles' early career, but he is credited with the sending out of kleroukies, which were colonial imperial ventures in order to place citizens, Athenian citizens, around the subject allies around the Delian League. Importantly, he is also associated with a law, the Periklean law, limiting Athenian citizenship to those with two Athenian parents, that is, an Athenian mother as well as an Athenian father. These are his two great early accomplishments. Perikles was fundamentally involved in Athens' public building program of the 440s and 430s, which we're going to discuss a little bit later on. This program became a wedge issue for Perikles' opponents, and his opponents included a man named Thucydides, not the famous author. However, in 443, Perikles was triumphant, and Thucydides Milesiou was ostracized. The building program commenced, continued, and was completed. According to Plutarch again, Perikles was elected general every year after the ostracism of Thucydides and was Athens' unchallenged political leader. He was elected general or strategos every year from 440 to 429. However, during this period, he was not without enemies. His friends and associates, his mistress Aspasia, the sophist Anaxagoras, and the sculptor Phidias were all prosecuted and attempted to be exiled. Perikles himself was charged with embezzlement, associating some of the funds that were meant for the Acropolis building program to his own benefit. He was, however, probably acquitted. All of this occurred during the 430s. Both the sophist Anaxagoras and Aspasia were accused of impiety, that is, not believing in the gods, but these charges were probably unfounded. She was blamed by Perikles' enemies to be the cause of Perikles prosecuting the Samian War in 440 BCE. This is the same war that actually Sophocles was a general at and was sort of the linchpin to Perikles' influence. Perikles' power came through his influence over the public assembly as a speaker, and then later as a general in the army. His political maneuverings were critical to the development of the Athenian Empire and the beginnings of the Peloponnesian War. For example, during the Samian revolt of Samos, as we were talking about, Perikles was the general, and during this war it was the first time he used funds from the Delian League to fund a purely Athenian campaign. This is right around the time the treasury got moved to Athens. According to Thucydides, Perikles' strategy for the Peloponnesian War was to stay inside the walls of the cities when the Peloponnesians invaded Attica, and then to rely on Athens' sea power and superior financial resources to outlast the Spartans. However, there are indications in the scale of Athens' expenditure and the naval activity in the opening years of the war that Thucydides' picture may have been distorted in just placing it particularly on Perikles. In 430, more conservative forces in Athens deposed him from the generalship and attempted unsuccessfully to negotiate with Sparta. However, he was re-elected, but then died from the plague which ravaged Athens in 429 BCE. Fundamentally, Perikles was an aristocrat who became a democratic leader. Thucydides, the author of the Peloponnesian War, describes him as incorruptible, far-sighted, a man who tried to lead the people rather than currying favor with them. However, on the other hand, we hear from authors such as Plato that actually Perikles was a demagogue in the earlier part of his career and a greater statesman in the later. He has an unshakable reputation as an impressive orator. Apparently his manner was fairly aloof, and he is said to have been uninterested in his family's concerns. His marriage, possibly to his cousin and Alcibiades' mother, Dynamike, was unhappy, but as we said, he formed a liaison with the Milesian Aspasia, and when his two sons by his Athenian wife had died from the plague, his son by Aspasia, also named Perikles, was made an Athenian citizen. So the main question surrounding his primary achievement, the Acropolis building program, was over it being a misuse of allied tribute. Did Perikles misuse the allied tribute in order to enrich his own city, Athens? Now, the building program included the construction of the Propylaea, the main gate to the Acropolis, the Parthenon, the main temple of Athena, and its gold cult statue of Athena sculpted by Perikles' friend Phidias, the Erechtheum, the temple of Erechtheus, and the temple of Athena Nike. In 449 BCE, right around the time of the Samian revolt, Perikles proposed using 9,000 talents of the Delian League's money for the rebuilding of Athenian temples. Recall that this money was from the treasury of Athena, and thus from the pool of allied tribute, originally the Delian League. The question was, is this embezzlement? Is this legal? This is how Plutarch describes the situation. Quote, "The people, or the demos, has lost its fame and is in ill repute, because it has removed the public money of the Greeks from Delos into its own keeping, and that seemliest of all excuses which it had to urge against its accusers, that is, that out of fear of the barbarians it took these public funds from Delos, was now guarding them in a stronghold of this Perikles had robbed it. And surely Greece is insulted with a dire insult and manifestly subject to tyranny when she sees that with her own enforced contributions for the war, we are gilding and decking out our own city as if it were a vain woman, adding to her wardrobe precious stones and costly temples, and temples worth their millions." The Parthenon was the temple of Athena Parthenos, that is Athena the maiden, built on the highest part of the Acropolis at Athens, south of the old archaic temple. Actually, a subsequent temple had been begun on the site after the Battle of Marathon, but work was abandoned upon the approach of the second invasion of the Persian War, that of Xerxes. What had at that point been built was then destroyed by the invasion Persians when they captured the city, and the Athenians fled to Troezen and then subsequently won at Salamis. The current Parthenon temple was begun in 447 BCE by Perikles. It was not a cult site per se. There were very few Greek temples that actually functioned in this way. The temple and cult statue were dedicated in 438, but work continued and the pediments were only completed in 432 BCE. The structure was built to house the gold and ivory statue by the famous sculptor Phidias. Instead of a specific place of worship, the Parthenon, like many other Greek temples, was the private home of the divinity where her image was stored and where a storehouse was kept for the cult's belongings. This is the cause of its being named a treasury. The Athenians used the Parthenon for both city treasury and Delian League treasury. The temple itself was designed by the architects Ictinus and Callicrates. The marble used was from the quarries of Mount Pentelicon, a few miles northeast of Athens. The famous Parthenon measures about 69.5 by 30.8 meters on the very top stylobator step. It has 8 Doric-style columns at the ends and 17 on the sides. The inner structure has a porch of 6 columns at each end. The larger eastern room had a 2-tiered inner colonnade running not only along the sides, but around the western end, behind the great cult statue. Recent work has shown that there were windows high to the sides of the east door. There were no straight lines in the design of the Parthenon. It was built with a slight swell in the columns and in the stylobate. That's the level ground at the top of the steps. This phenomenon is meant to create a cohesive aesthetic feel when looking at the temple and is called entasis. The sculptural program of the Parthenon is elaborate, extensive, and famous. Every metope is carved, while the porch colonnades have a continuous frieze extending the entire length of the cella outer walls. The pediments, the triangular sculpted portions to the front and back of the temple, were the latest and last addition to the Parthenon sculptural program. In the east, these sculptures showed Athena newly sprung from the head of Zeus, and on the west side it was the contest of Poseidon and Athena for the land of Attica. The metopes, which were square spaces above the columnar facade, showed in high relief mythical combats. On the south side there were the Lapis and the Centaurs. On the east we have the gods and the giants. On the west, the Greeks and the Amazons. And on the north, probably because these are very, very difficult to discern, we have Trojan scenes of the Trojan War. Now the Parthenon frieze in low relief depicts the Panathenaic procession, which we'll discuss in a little bit. The pediment sculptures on the east, as we said, was the birth of Athena, and on the west, the conflict between Athena and Poseidon over control of Athens. The phrase the Elgin Marbles refers to the fact that from 1801 to 1812, agents of Thomas Bruce, the 7th Earl of Elgin, removed the sculptures which are now in the British Museum. The newly built Acropolis Museum in Athens, right across the street from the Acropolis, is where they will be housed if and when they return to Greece. The Propylaea, or monumental roofed gateway of the Acropolis, was built between 436 and 432 BCE. It is approached by an inclined ramp continuing up the natural slope of the rock of the Acropolis. Started well before the Persian Wars, it was burnt by Xerxes' invading force in 479 and then completed by Perikles. The Periklean structure is constructed of Pentelic marble and designed by the architect Mnesicles. The front gate or hall had its roof supported by 2 rows of Ionic columns, the central passage having a span of about 4.5 meters. Now, the second most famous building in Perikles' building program was the Erechtheum. The Erechtheum, or the Erechtheum, was built in 421 BCE and finished after a lapse in construction in 407. It was built of marble from Mount Pentelicon, just like the Parthenon and the Propylaea. Amazingly, exact details of its building are known from an inscription, which actually lists the finances and logistics of its construction over the years. The main structure of the Erechtheum is divided into 4 compartments. The largest side, or the east cella, has an Ionic colonnade and portico. To the west end is the unique and boldly projecting Porch of the Maidens. Maidens in Greek is chorai. These chorai are draped female figures who serve as supports, just like columns. And nearly opposite the north side, we have a different projecting porch with Ionic columns. Because the Erechtheum had replaced an extremely ancient temple to Athena, whose foundations can be seen today between the Erechtheum and the modern Parthenon, it housed a number of very ancient cults and many sacred loci or spots and objects. For example, in the Erechtheum was the ancient olive wood image of Athena of the city, the most ancient image of Athena. This image was supposedly actually not even constructed by man. Note that the Athena Parthenos was constructed by Phidias, but actually Athena Polias had fallen directly from heaven, was a gift from God. The Erechtheum contains a golden lamp made by the artist Callimachus, a salt well which served as the mark of Poseidon's trident. The Erechtheum was also famous for being the end point and the focal point around which the procession of the Parthenon was organized. The Erechtheum was also said to be the spot where the original sacred olive tree of Athena was said to have sprouted when she won the competition with Poseidon to be the namesake of the city of Athens. Associated with the building program are also famous statues that were built at the same time. The statue of Athena Promachos, she who fights in the forefront, was made with bronze actually captured from Persian armor and also sculpted by Phidias. This statue was nearby. The temple of Athena Nike was finished in the 420s BCE. As a whole, the temple building complex and program is best interpreted as a thank offering or dedication for the final successful outcome of the wars with Persia. Generally speaking, the entire Acropolis and everything on it, including the Propylaea and the Parthenon, can be considered a dedication to the goddess Athena. The Greek word for this was anathemata. The sculpture actually alludes to the glorification of the Greek and specifically the Athenian contributions to these very important victories. The final element of Athenian cultural and artistic might of the 5th century we're going to talk about is the Panathenea. The Panathenea was a huge New Year's Attic festival, which was originally celebrated yearly in the month of Hekatombion, which is roughly August. Now, when Athens began to expand its empire in the middle of the 5th century, the Greater Panathenea was instituted and actually held every 4 years. It was held with grandiose athletic competitions and a festival of Panhellenic scope and ambition. In the 5th century, when Athenians was accruing its empire, these subject allies were required to participate in the procession of Athens, which thus became a symbol of imperial power. The core of the festival was the Great Procession, which was evoked on the Parthenon frieze. In this frieze, we see representations of different sections of Athenian society marching, and even non-citizen medics. They rode or marched from the Kerameikos section of Athens, through the marketplace or agora, to the Acropolis and the Erechtheum. The aim of the procession was to present a robe, in Greek peplos, to Athena, which, according to some of our evidence, was actually large enough to be hung on the mast of a ship on wheels and spread out like a sail. It was embroidered with the scenes from the Gigantomachy, that is the story of Zeus and Athena's defeat of the giants in Greek mythology after Zeus's accession to power. The night before the event, most likely, we had choirs or choruses of boys and maidens, and each of these celebrated a night festival or a panikos. The procession proper, as I said, was from the cemetery, the Kerameikos, through the Athenian Agora to the Temple of Athena Polias on the Acropolis. Afterwards, there was a large sacrifice, the meat from which was certainly publicly distributed. Special place in the procession was assigned to various hierarchical groups of Athenian society. We had, as we said, the medics, we had the cavalry soldiers, we had the non-citizens, and then we had the freedmen. In the procession, representatives of conquered states, that is, the subject allies we mentioned before, were actually presented in the procession as colonists. They were required to take part. The greater Parthenon also included major athletic and musical competitions, which were open to everybody in Greece and lasted several days. Winners in these competitions received money prizes or olive oil contained in distinctive Panathenaic prize amphoras. It is possible that a smaller and possibly unadorned robe may have been presented to Athena in these years of the lesser or smaller Panathenea. The procession, as we mentioned, was depicted on the frieze of the Parthenon, the long sculpture erected inside the colonnade along the inner porch of the Parthenon. The frieze is generally seen as a pretty accurate depiction of the Panathenaic procession, even though the details of the references are actually much disputed. For example, there are multiple horsemen on the frieze of the Parthenon, which we have no evidence for in the actual procession. So that's the Panathenea. Next time we're going to look at the end of the Peloponnesian War and the 4th century in Greece. Thanks a lot, guys.